Hello, everyone. Welcome back from our week of Thanksgiving break. I'm sorry that I actually forgot about Thanksgiving break when I was typing up the syllabus. I didn't make room for it. And so, really, what I want to do today is kind of cover the readings that we were going to have read for last week because that was my fault. So, there were some readings on the syllabus that don't quite match up. The ones that were due this week were extra material that I was going to send out to you as a PDF, but don't worry about those. Since I messed up the schedule and forgot to schedule in the holiday break, we'll just go with those readings that were in the textbook instead. Well, we are into the last couple weeks of class now, and because of that, I want to say a few reminders. The first reminder is that the synthesis assignment, your fourth and final major writing project in this class, is going to be due on December 7th. So hopefully at this point you've at least begun to think about what you'd like to do, what topic you are interested in covering, as well as what genre of writing you're going to cover it in. And we're going to use the readings for today or for this week rather, as a sort of example of how you might go about constructing a synthesis essay. And hopefully that will be helpful to you if you have any questions or if you're struggling on this assignment. Another reminder is that because we're coming up on finals week, I do just want to say that for those of you who still have missing assignments, there are some of you. I'm being more lenient this semester than I usually would have been with like deadlines and things like that, just because it's been a crazy semester. Obviously, we haven't met like we usually would have, and so I'm allowing assignments to be submitted really right up to finals week this time. So if there's anything that you haven't done yet that still needs to be turned in, go ahead and send them to me. Just get something turned in, and that way I can get them graded for you. That goes for the writing assignments as well as the journal. The weekly reading reflections and lecture responses as well. Catch up on those if you're behind on them, because there were some points too. So hopefully that will help some people out. I know that these last couple weeks of any semester are stressful with other things going on and other classes. A whole bunch of big projects sometimes come together at once, and it's just a nightmare. So don't stress out about things being late necessarily in this class, as long as they're turned in by the time finals week is over. So I'll say December 12th. By December 12th, you really need to have everything turned in order for me to get it graded on time. And if you have any questions on that, you can always reach out to me by email and ask me, let me know. But yeah, those are my announcements. I don't think next week I'll do a lecture because that would be the last week of class, and what we would have been doing if we'd been meeting in person is we would have been workshopping them. So there would have been very little of just me talking. It would have been us in small groups working on our essays, giving each other ideas. And so for this semester, I'm not going to make you have to listen to a whole nother lecture again, when really you could be using that time to be getting the synthesis assignment done. So don't think that there's just no more work to do. There's definitely work to do. Just I think it benefits you more to have time to do the work than to put out another lecture. And hopefully you won't mind that. So let's talk about the 3 readings for last week. And if you got a chance to read them, I'm wondering if you thought of what the common theme between them might have been. I did pick out essays that were all dealing with a certain similar topic because, again, like I was saying, I want to use these essays as an example of how you could take 3 separate stories and sort of draw out a similar idea or an overarching theme from all of them and make your own idea about it. So briefly, I'll go ahead and kind of spoil the surprise here, but if you read them, maybe you picked up on it anyway. All 3 of these essays, in their own unique way, were dealing with the topic of life and death. more specifically about death and dying. What happens? How do we view death when it strikes us or when it occurs to a family member? What do we think about the afterlife? What do we think about fear of the unknown? All these different things. And these essays all hit on those themes. So I want you to imagine that you are going to write your synthesis essay, and you decided to write it about the topic of life and death, or how close all of us are at any given time to dying, the mortality, the awareness of the fact that we're mortal creatures, things like that. Say that was a theme that interested you, and that you wanted to look at how that theme was explicated in the writings of other authors. And you don't quite know what you're going to say about the theme yet. All you know is that you like that theme, you like that idea. And again, remember that if you are struggling with coming up with a theme or a topic for your synthesis essay, you can go through the table of contents by theme, which is at the beginning of the 50 Essays book, and that has all the readings grouped underneath headings that tell you what the themes of them are. So say history and politics interests you, or the workforce and class, you wanted to write about that. Some of these are a bit more detailed than others. There's looking at nature, cultures of violence, living poor, moral choices, avoiding the truth. There's a whole lot of themes. So don't feel that you're kind of out in the deep end without any sort of guidepost as to what theme you want to choose. You can choose just one of these themes from the 50 Essays anthology if you can't think of anything on your own, because I know that can be kind of a overwhelming, daunting thing to do. So flip through them, look through them, see if there's any theme that you like. And once you've picked it, eventually you're going to have to decide what you want to say about it. So in this hypothetical example that we're going over, I picked the theme of death. Now, that isn't really an argument that can be made about anything. It's a theme. It's just death or life and death, whatever you want to say about it. But to turn it into an essay, again, depending on what sort of writing style that I'm going for, what sort of genre or mode that I decide to do, if I want to do an argumentative essay or a persuasive essay, I'm going to have some sort of thesis statement about death or some sort of argument about it. And we'll see, it's different from writer to writer. Some people, it's easier to come up with that thesis or that argument first and then turn to the readings to try to get different ideas for how those readings could support the thesis. Other people might want to do the readings first and see, okay, so these three authors all point out this interesting fact about whatever topic that I decide that I want to talk about. So maybe I'll make that my thesis. So however works best for you, really. If you have a good argument about your topic that you want to make, start there. But if you just have a general idea of what the theme is, that's okay too. Go ahead and read the essays, and then maybe the argument or the thesis will come to you as you're reading them. So these three essays, like I said, all deal with the theme of death. They're all very interesting. The one by Feet and Smoke by John Jeremiah Sullivan, it was a really interesting one where the guy's telling the story about how his brother was in a band and he accidentally electrocuted himself, and he was in the hospital, and he was basically dead for a certain number of time, for a certain number of minutes, and then they were able to revive him. But what's interesting about this story is that it starts out kind of like somber and tragic. He's telling this story about his brother, and they thought that they'd lost him. The family's crying, everything's dramatic. And then when the brother wakes up, it kind of takes a turn for the comedic, because the brother, his mind's been kind of scrambled, and he's saying all these silly, ridiculous things that don't seem to make sense. And so the author's talking about how he and his family were like writing down some of the weird, semi-nonsense statements that he was making from the hospital bed. At one point he says, if you're interested, He says that this whole incident actually ended up on a TV show on an episode of Rescue 911, which I guess was a reality show that was hosted by William Shatner, and each episode would go over some sort of a 911 situation where they'd interview the paramedics who were involved and things like that. And it is on YouTube, this episode specifically that he's talking about. It was called, what was it called? One second, let me look it up in my thing here. And it's funny because he's talking about this episode and how it was similar to real life as well as how it was different. And then it is on YouTube, and you have a chance to see it if you want to, so you can sort of see what you were reading acted out. I'm a fan of that. It's why I always like to watch like a film adaptation of a book that I read. Even if it's a bad adaptation, it's still interesting to kind of see what somebody else thought the author was saying and to see that portrayed on screen too. What was the name of that? I had it written down. The Moviegoers. Yeah, that's right. So if you were to go on YouTube and search The Moviegoers Rescue 911, something like that, this episode that's covering his brother being electrocuted should show up. If you're interested, if you want to read it. But it's the interest to me for my hypothetical essay about death is more about something that he says near the end of the essay. The author is talking about how at one point he looked over at his brother and he was crying. He said, "Well, what's the matter? Why were you crying?" He says, "I was thinking of the vision I had when I knew I was dead." And then he describes this really weird sort of vision that he had and that he thinks that he had in the afterlife. And the author's kind of racking his brain trying to figure out, well, how did he come up with this sort of vision? He's not a very religious person. He's not a churchgoer. There were elements of it from Greek mythology. There were elements of it from literature. I guess Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn and were in this dream. And so he's saying it was kind of a weird blending of different ideas. But he asks the question, where did this vision come from? And that's interesting to me for my purposes of the death essay, because if I'm writing about death, I probably do want to at least touch on the subtopic of what happens after death. Is there an afterlife? And what's it like? What have people who have had near-death experiences seen, or what have they claimed to have seen? And this whole passage would kind of supply evidence for that sort of argument that I was going to make. The other essay by Brian Doyle, it's not so much of a personal story as Feet and Smoke was. This is more of a scientific essay. And he starts out by talking about the heartbeat of a hummingbird and how fast it beats. And then he moves on and he's talking about all these other different animals as well. And each time he keeps coming back to these heartbeats. And it's really interesting because even though it's a scientific essay, actually it's more of a popular science essay, he draws a sort of philosophical moral from it, or a practical moral. He says, hummingbirds, like all flying birds, but more so, have incredibly immense, ferocious metabolisms. To drive those metabolisms, they have race car hearts that eat oxygen at an eye-popping rate. They have more mitochondria in their heart muscles, anything to gulp more oxygen. Their hearts are stripped to the skin for the war against gravity and inertia, the mad search for food, the insane idea of flight. The price of their ambition is a life closer to death. They suffer heart attacks and aneurysms and ruptures more than any other living creature. It's expensive to fly. You burn out. You fry the machine. You melt the engine. Every creature on Earth has approximately 2 billion heartbeats to spend in a lifetime. You can spend them slowly, like a tortoise, and live to be 200 years old, or you can spend them fast, like a hummingbird, and live to be 2 years old. So, notice the shift that he makes there from talking about just facts, the heartbeats of hummingbirds, what their hearts are like. And then he sort of makes this comment that you can decide how you want to live your life. You can live life in the fast lane, I guess you could say, but you tend to burn out when you do that. If you're a workaholic, or if you're somebody who's an adrenaline junkie and you like to take all of these crazy risks, there's a price for that, and the price for that is that it tears up your body, or it wears you down mentally and physically, and in the end, you're still getting the same amount, he seems to be saying, of life out of your life. It's just you had it compressed into a more limited time frame than somebody who maybe lays around all day and doesn't do anything. They don't have much to stress them or concern them about, except for maybe the fact that they're laying around and not doing anything. That can become stressful in the future. But, the heartbeat, it doesn't exactly add up one to one with like a human life, but he compares it to the tortoise. The tortoise lives slowly, takes his time, and therefore he lives much longer than the hummingbird. But the number of heartbeats, he says, are still the same, which is interesting. And I don't know, reading this essay made me think about, how we should live our lives with reference to the fact that, one day we will die. And so how do we want to spend our lives? It's something that I think everybody should ask themselves at some point. And this essay kind of made me think about that. And so how I would use this essay in my synthesis about death. This is such a cheery topic, I know, but it was just the one that seemed to come naturally as I was going over the readings for this class and trying to think of a good synthesis idea. The way that I would use this essay to talk about death would be to maybe write about how the idea of death, not so much as being a fear that one day it will come, but really that it's kind of a motivator. It's a reminder. It used to be called the memento mori, that one day you would die, that you get motivation from that. You know that your time's limited, and that so you shouldn't waste it. You shouldn't watch your days slip by and not really make anything of them, keeping in mind that each day is precious. And on that note, the third essay by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, I think I'm pronouncing that name right. It's another personal essay. This one's about a woman who goes into a field office for a newspaper, and she's looking at all these headlines and photographs that are up on the wall that are going to make the evening edition or whatever. And she sees a photograph of a dead body, and it takes her a minute, but she's looking at it, and then she realizes that the photograph is of somebody that she used to know, somebody that was a friend of hers. And there's a couple passages that are just interesting. She talks about how she went into the newspaper office kind of really excited because she was going to have one of her poems published. And she says, "I was trying to remember what I had felt when I saw the photo of the dead person on the wall and realized that it was Namdi. Namdi. I'm probably pronouncing that name wrong as well. But I think that's interesting that for a moment she couldn't recognize that it was somebody that she knew, because mentally she looked at the photo and just saw a dead body. She didn't really see it as the body of somebody that she had once known. And I think that's a common experience in the face of death. I'll just, kind of share one of my stories or one of my experiences with it. I remember about 2 years ago, my grandmother died. And it was interesting because when we went to the funeral, and maybe you can relate to this if you've been to the funeral, especially of a loved one before, the undertaker, does their best to dress up the deceased person nicely, to put the makeup on them, but it doesn't really quite strike you as that person, if that makes sense. I remember looking at my grandmother in the coffin and thinking, I can tell, it's her. There's not anything outwardly that's changed about her appearance. Those are her eyelids that are closed. That's her mouth, and those are the creases on her forehead. That's all the same, but at the same time, it's something dramatically different from what was my grandma. And there's this sort of dissociation that happens there where it's like, oh, it's her, but it's not her, because the part of her that made her isn't there anymore. it's not really her essence anymore. She's not a human being. It's just a body. And I think that the author of To My One Love is describing something similar. When she saw that photo, she didn't recognize her friend at first. She just perceived a corpse. And then eventually, like, the link was made and she realized, oh, that's him. And so there are a lot of interesting things that these essays bring up. Those are just sort of the ones that popped out to me, the themes. But of course, they do all have death in common. So if I was writing an essay about life and death, what sort of topics could I think about including in my essay based on what we've talked about? Well, we could talk about, concerns for what happens after death. What have near-death experiences been like for people? We could also talk about how, what do we make of death now while we're living? Should we fear it, or should we be motivated by it, or should we try to ignore it? You can see how there's different subtopics forming or different arguments. And there's other themes that those essays touch on. How it affects family members was one of them, or how it affects friends. And you could form a synthesis essay about this. Maybe my theme could be that we shouldn't fear death because, one, well, we don't know what it is, we don't know what it's like, and two, it can be a good thing if we're reminded of it, because it can motivate us to live better lives while we are still alive. That could be my theme, and then I could have the subtopics or the arguments for that theme. And another important point for the synthesis essay, I could borrow the quotes from the essays that I just read to you and put those quotes in the synthesis essay to underscore my topic, because you do have to use quotations from the essays that you're going to be using in this assignment, unless you're doing a creative assignment of some sort. If you're writing a short story or a poem, you don't have to use direct quotes from the essays that you're borrowing. You just have to make a reference to them in some way. We covered that in the last lecture that we did, so you can go back and listen to that again if you have any further questions on that. Or you can just read the assignment description and guidelines PDF as well, because that covers that too. So that's hopefully sort of an example. And again, it's kind of a bleak one. Sorry about that. The last lecture of the class. Let's end it by talking about, death and morbid things. But yeah, that's just kind of how it panned out. But hopefully that was a good example to you if you are kind of struggling with this synthesis assignment of how to go about constructing an argument, or at least extracting various different themes from the essays in the 50 essay anthology. Remember, you do have to use at least 3 of them, and you can use more if you want to. But again, yeah, I would just encourage you to find out what your theme's going to be, develop a thesis and argument if you have one. If not, find the essays that cover that theme, go through, highlight them, mark things that pop out at you or that seem interesting to you. And then after that, maybe sit down and try to construct an argument based around similar things that all the essays said. So that will be it for the readings for this week. And like I said, I don't think I'm going to do another lecture because next week I'd rather have you focused on work. So I do just want to say thank you for a good class this semester. Thank you for participating in the lecture reflections and the reading reflections. I tried to respond to as many of them as I could. There were some weeks where I fell behind, but I really did enjoy getting your thoughts on the different readings that we did, and seeing especially how a lot of you related those readings back to things that have happened in your own lives and in your personal lives. That in itself is a sort of synthesis that happens that's really interesting. When you do a lot of reading, you realize that you're not alone in the world. Really, you realize, oh wow, this author is saying something that I can relate to, that I've thought about, or they might be saying something that I've gone through, And it's a really interesting feeling. It's one of the reasons that I love reading, and one of, the most important benefits of not just critical reading, but reading in general. So I'd encourage you to keep following those threads that you developed in this class. If a specific style of writing really jumped out at you, or if a specific author you read and you thought, wow, that was just really interesting. And don't let it end with this class. Find more works by that author, or find other writings that are similar to the ones that you liked. Do some exploring on your own and really build up your corpus of books, of reading. And I think it's a very rewarding way to spend your time. Kind of taking it back to the first lecture of this course. Is reading worthwhile? Are you going to get your money's worth, metaphorically, out of it if you spend time doing it? And I think definitely you will. Okay, so of course, as always, email me if you have any questions. I'm always here to help, and I will maybe see you all on campus at some point. If you see me and you recognize me, stop me and say hi. I don't know what some of you look like, but you can say, hey, I was in your online critical reading class, and then I will know right away. Alrighty, thank you. Have a good one.